8 days. That's how long it took for the body of the most wanted man in Mexico to travel from a mountainside in Jalisco to a golden casket in Zapopan. 8 days, and somewhere inside that window, something happened that nobody in power wanted filmed, photographed, or questioned. The funeral happened anyway. The cameras came anyway, and an Italian student left that cemetery with broken teeth and a stolen camera for trying to document a burial that was supposedly open to the public. So let's ask the question the official timeline never really answers. What actually happened to El Mencho's body, and why does the government's version still have so many gaps? On March 2nd, 2026, the remains of Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, known to the world as El Mencho, were lowered into the ground at the Recinto de la Paz Cemetery in Zapopan, a suburb of Guadalajara. But this was no ordinary burial. The casket was gold, not silver, not black, gold, the chromatic declaration of narco royalty, the color chosen by a man who commanded a criminal empire, generating an estimated $20 to $30 billion annually, and wanted every mourner in that cemetery to feel the weight of what they were witnessing. Enormous floral wreaths encircled the casket on every side, and among them, one arrangement stood apart, a rooster sculpted entirely from flowers, a direct visual tribute to his most famous nickname, El Señor de los Gallos, Lord of the Roosters. 5 trucks followed the hearse from the funeral home to the cemetery, loaded with additional floral tributes, cutting slowly through the streets of Guadalajara's San Andres neighborhood, while regional Mexican banda music played from speakers that made no attempt at discretion. One of the songs was El Muchacho Alegre, the cheerful young man, at a funeral secured by 80 armed personnel. Think about that for a moment. The security apparatus surrounding that burial was a combination of Mexican Army, National Guard, and state police. 80 individuals, uniformed, armed, and present for a reason that nobody in charge was willing to state plainly. Were they there to protect the mourners, to observe and catalogue who showed up, to prevent a rival cartel from converting a burial into a bloodbath? The honest answer is probably all three, and none of those explanations are reassuring. The grave plot itself was described as deliberately minimal, plain, unpretentious, nothing like the elaborate mausoleums that mark narco burial sites across Sinaloa and Jalisco. Whether that simplicity was chosen to reduce the site's symbolic magnetism or simply because the family preferred it, nobody official said, but whatever the reasoning behind the grave, the ceremony around it made restraint impossible. Mourners arrived carrying black umbrellas under a clear sky. No rain, no forecast of rain. The umbrellas were not weather protection. They were visual shields, angled upward to block cameras, obscure faces, and keep the attendance record as incomplete as possible. It didn't work. Video footage circulated across social media within hours. The golden casket unmistakable, the rooster wreath visible above the crowd, the banda music audible beneath the ambient noise of a cemetery that had never seen anything like this. The imagery moved fast and traveled far. By nightfall, it had reached audiences on every continent. And then the moment that cut through even that spectacle, an Italian exchange student attempting to film the proceedings was assaulted, broken teeth, equipment stolen. Security forces standing nearby were reportedly slow to intervene. This was not random cartel aggression. This was a boundary being enforced, a message delivered in broad daylight in a public cemetery with 80 armed personnel watching, that this event had rules the public was not invited to negotiate. The fact that it happened at all, that a foreign student could be physically attacked for trying to document a burial while soldiers stood close enough to hear it, that detail tells you more about the nature of that day than any official statement ever will. Here's a comparison worth sitting with. When Osama bin Laden was eliminated in May 2011, the United States made a deliberate and permanent decision within hours. No land burial, no named grave, no location that could calcify into a gathering point. His body was wrapped, placed on a board, and committed to the North Arabian Sea from the deck of the USS Carl Vinson. The stated rationale was explicit: prevent any site from becoming a shrine. The handling of El Mencho's remains moved in precisely the opposite direction. A named cemetery in a major city, a gold casket, rooster-shaped floral arrangements, 5 trucks of flowers, banda music, 80 soldiers, a plot anyone with a map and an internet connection could find by sundown. Critics were swift to question whether Mexican authorities had just created exactly the kind of pilgrimage site they would eventually spend resources trying to suppress. Officials maintained they had followed legal protocol. The family had rights to the remains. The burial was lawful. That protocol produced a spectacle that circled the globe in under 24 hours, and the golden casket with the rooster wreath became the defining image of the end of Mexico's most wanted man. But here's what nobody is talking about. Before any of that imagery existed, before the casket, before the music, before the broken teeth, there was a body that needed to be confirmed as his. And that process is where the story gets genuinely complicated. El Mencho's remains did not go directly to his family. They went first to Mexico City, transported under heavy security in a forensic ambulance escorted by National Guard units, directly to the Federal Attorney General's office, the FGR. The capital was already destabilizing. Reports of cartel retaliation were flooding in from Jalisco, Michoacán, and elsewhere. But inside a secured forensic facility, a different operation was underway, one that was quieter, more precise, and arguably more consequential than the raid that had started everything. The government needed to prove, beyond legal and scientific challenge, that the man in that body bag was actually El Mencho. And the reason this mattered so much goes deeper than procedure. Mexico carries institutional trauma around announced cartel deaths. When Arturo Beltran Leyva was eliminated in 2009, questions persisted for years about whether the identification was airtight, partly because the photographic record was disputed and the evidentiary handling left room for doubt. For a figure of El Mencho's magnitude, a man with a $15 million US government bounty on his head, confirmed operations across more than 40 countries, and a cartel that had spent years refining the craft of disinformation, the government could not afford a repeat of that ambiguity. The forensic process had to be thorough enough to withstand not just legal scrutiny, but the information warfare the CJNG would inevitably launch the moment it had something to deny. An autopsy was performed by FGR forensic pathologists. Cause of death: multiple gunshot wounds. But the autopsy was only the first layer. DNA testing was conducted with a dual purpose: to conclusively confirm El Mencho's identity and to establish documented biological links with the family members who would later claim the remains. This dual function mattered legally. It created a verifiable biological chain connecting the man who fell in Tapalpa to the family receiving his body in Guadalajara. A death certificate was subsequently issued, noting that interment was required given the violent circumstances of death, a legal designation that also preserved the government's option to exhume the remains if future judicial proceedings demanded it. The body's transit was handled with the kind of security intensity normally reserved for live criminal operations, a convoy departing from a secured hangar at Mexico City's airport. Coordinated movements, protocols that made the transfer of a corpse resemble in logistical complexity the transfer of a high-value prisoner. Then came the decision that changed everything. The government announced it would not release photographs of the body. Officials cited 2 justifications: operational security surrounding the details of the raid and respect for the dignity of the family. Both precedents existed in prior cases. Neither explanation was enough to contain what happened next, because in the information environment of 2026, the absence of a photograph is not silence, it is an invitation. And the CJNG had been preparing for exactly that invitation for years. Social media filled within hours. El Mencho was alive. The man in the body bag was a double. The entire operation was theater, a carefully staged performance designed to satisfy Washington's demands for results, despite official confirmation from Mexico's Defense Department, the FGR, and corroborating coverage from the Associated Press, Reuters, CNN, NPR, and the New York Times. The skepticism did not accumulate gradually, it detonated. But before we get to the information war, and that story is darker than you think, you need to understand what actually happened in Tapalpa, because the raid itself raises questions that the official account still hasn't fully answered. On the morning of February 22nd, 2026, Mexican security forces acting on U.S. intelligence launched a simultaneous helicopter and ground assault on a luxury estate in Tapalpa, Jalisco, a remote mountain town sitting at altitude in the Sierra de Tapalpa range. The estate was El Mencho's refuge. The intelligence that located him was described as precise real-time tracking data, the kind of granular location information that Mexican forces, across years of searching, had repeatedly failed to sustain on their own. American involvement in supplying that intelligence was not incidental. It was the operational difference between this raid and every previous attempt. What followed was not a surrender. El Mencho and two bodyguards attempted to reach a wooded section of the estate on foot. Soldiers cut them off. He was 59 years old, an age he had reached in spite of being the single most hunted individual in Mexico, in spite of kidney failure that reportedly required regular dialysis, in spite of a $15 million US bounty that theoretically made everyone within his orbit a potential informant. He sustained multiple gunshot wounds to his chest, abdomen, and legs. He was airlifted immediately, the intention being medical stabilization and transport to a hospital in Mexico City. He never arrived. He lost his life during the flight, somewhere in the airspace between Jalisco and the capital, bleeding out above the country he had spent decades terrorizing. 2 bodyguards fell at the scene. 4 cartel members were gone in total from the immediate confrontation. 3 of those, including El Mencho, died in the aftermath. 2 suspects were taken into custody. Weapons recovered at the site included rocket launchers. 3 Mexican military personnel were wounded, but survived. Officials described the operation as one of the most significant blows to organized crime in Mexican history, comparable in scale to the recapture of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman in 2016, comparable in scale to the recapture of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman in 2016. That comparison is instructive in one direction and misleading in another. El Chapo's recapture had a second act: extradition, trial, life imprisonment in a U.S. supermax facility. El Mencho's elimination had no second act, and the organization he built was not the Sinaloa cartel. It was constructed with a different architecture and a specific purpose that becomes critical once you understand what that architecture was designed to survive. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes was born on July 17, 1966, in the rural community of Cuelotel, in Aguililla, Michoacán, into a family of avocado farmers. He left school in the 5th grade. In the 1980s, he crossed illegally into the United States, eventually settling in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he entered the narcotics trade. In 1994, a federal court in the Northern District of California convicted him of conspiracy to distribute heroin, and he served nearly 3 years before deportation back to Mexico. He returned to Michoacán and embedded himself with the Milenio cartel, rising through the organization under Ignacio Nacho Coronel Villarreal, a senior methamphetamine operator within the broader Sinaloa structure. When government pressure dismantled the Milenio cartel following Coronel's death in 2010, El Mencho aligned with a breakaway faction called Los Torcidos, which reorganized and rebranded as the Jalisco New Generation cartel around the same period. What happened after that is not a drug lord success story. It is something more disturbing: the construction of a transnational infrastructure that made every previous Mexican cartel look provincial by comparison. By 2025, the CJNG had active operations across 28 of Mexico's 32 states. It controlled key Pacific ports like Manzanillo for importing chemical precursors from China, processed those materials into fentanyl and methamphetamine at industrial scale, and distributed the product across the United States, Europe, Asia, Australia, Africa, and Canada. The cartel's annual revenue was estimated between $20 and $30 billion. Its operations contributed to over 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States every single year. El Mencho was not merely a criminal. He was, by every empirical measure, the most dangerous man in Mexico. And on February 22, 2026, he bled out somewhere in the sky above it. The moment confirmation of the raid spread, Mexico didn't pause. The violence arrived before the official statement did. This was not a single city reacting. This was a cartel operating across 28 states, and every one of those cells received the same signal simultaneously. What followed was coordinated, not chaotic, and that distinction matters enormously. The death toll connected to the aftermath of El Mencho's elimination reached approximately 70 people within the following week. Among the fallen, 25 National Guard troops, taken down not in crossfire, but in deliberate ambushes, planned, staged, and executed with military precision in the hours immediately after the raid, as the cartel's distributed command structure absorbed the news and issued its response. CJNG operatives blocked highways, set buildings on fire, and engaged security forces across at least 20 states. Reports documented 252 separate blockades. This was not grief. It was not panic. It was a coordinated national demonstration, a signal broadcast simultaneously across the country that the organization El Mencho had built remained operational, could reach anywhere, and was willing to eliminate soldiers in deliberate ambushes to prove it. Jalisco saw school cancellations and suspended soccer matches. Michoacan, El Mencho's birth state, and one of the CJNG's deepest strongholds, was severely disrupted. Flights were cancelled, tourists sheltered inside hotels, unable to get clearance to move. The response placed enormous pressure on President Claudia Sheinbaum's security infrastructure, an apparatus already operating under sustained scrutiny from the Trump administration, which had spent months threatening direct U.S. military intervention in Mexico over the fentanyl crisis. El Mencho's elimination was, in part, the answer to that pressure. The violence that erupted in its wake was the price, and the bill was still being counted when the next shock landed. El Mencho's closest operational commander, known as El Tuli, was eliminated in a separate confrontation shortly after, found with millions in cash at the time of his death. The timing collapsed, the succession crisis that analysts had projected would unfold over months into something that needed resolution in days. Two of the cartel's most senior figures were gone within the same operational window. The question of who now controlled the CJNG was no longer hypothetical. It was urgent, and the answer was not simple, because El Mencho had specifically designed it not to be. Unlike the Sinaloa cartel, which was historically structured around the personal authority of figures like El Chapo, El Mencho built the CJNG on a franchise model. Local criminal organizations could affiliate with the cartel in exchange for branding, weapons, training, and revenue sharing while maintaining regional autonomy and territorial control. This semi-decentralized structure meant the organization could absorb the loss of its highest leadership without structural collapse, not because the cartel became leaderless, but because leadership had been deliberately distributed across dozens of regional nodes that had never required El Mencho's daily direction to function. The most obvious heir, his son Ruben El Menchito Oseguera Gonzalez, had already been removed from the equation, sentenced to life imprisonment in the United States in 2025 for trafficking more than 50 metric tons of cocaine and pioneering the mass distribution of fentanyl-laced counterfeit pills. El Menchito was out before his father died. The remaining candidates included El Mencho's stepson, Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, known as L03, who had commanded elite armed units within the cartel structure and may, according to multiple reports, have already assumed operational control in the immediate aftermath. Additional contenders included regional commanders Audias Flores Silva, Hugo Gonzalo Mendoza Gaetan, Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, and Heraclio Guerrero Martinez, each controlling their own territorial power base, each with separate incentives to consolidate, and none of them inclined toward deference. Analysts predicted internal friction, but stopped well short of forecasting fragmentation, pointing to the franchise architecture as the cartel's built-in insurance against collapse. Meanwhile, the Sinaloa cartel, already fractured following the 2024 arrest of Ismael El Mayo Zambada and the surrender of Joaquin Guzman Lopez, was scanning for signs of CJNG vulnerability. Whether it detected any would shape the geography of Mexican organized crime for the foreseeable future, and hovering over all of it, the FIFA World Cup 2026, with multiple Mexican cities scheduled as host venues that summer. 70 dead, 252 blockades, cancelled flights, shuttered schools across multiple states, in a country 4 months away from welcoming the global sporting world through its doors. The pressure on the Mexican government was absolute. The cartel was wounded. Whether it was broken remained an entirely open question, and while that question was still live, a separate war had already begun. One fought not with weapons, but with images. Here's what's genuinely unsettling about that war. The CJNG had been preparing for it before February 22nd ever happened. The government's decision not to release photographs of El Mencho's body, defended on grounds of operational security and family dignity, became, in the information environment of 2026, something closer to an accelerant. Because when you eliminate the most visible figure in the most documented criminal organization on Earth, and then decline to show the world visual proof, you do not create silence, you create a vacuum. And vacuums, in the age of algorithmic amplification and AI-generated content, do not stay empty. Despite official confirmation from Mexico's Defense Department, the FGR, and independent verification from the Associated Press, Reuters, CNN, NPR, and the New York Times, among dozens of other outlets with reporters physically present in Mexico, the skepticism that spread across social media was not gradual. It was immediate, organized, and layered into 3 distinct and increasingly sophisticated strands that each deserves individual examination. The first strand was geopolitical. Under this reading, the raid was not primarily a law enforcement operation. It was a diplomatic transaction. The Trump administration had spent months issuing explicit threats of direct U.S. military intervention in Mexico over the fentanyl crisis, applying bilateral pressure that had placed the Sheinbaum government in an increasingly untenable position by early 2026. El Mencho's elimination, under this theory, was the deliverable, the proof of cooperation that Washington required before Sheinbaum could argue against intervention. The raid was real. The death may have been real, but the timing and the specific target were chosen as much for their diplomatic utility as for their law enforcement logic. This theory could not be proven. The geopolitical context it described, however, was entirely accurate. The second strand was darker and cut closer to the question of why he died in the air rather than in a courtroom. El Mencho had operated inside Mexico for over a decade. He had corrupted law enforcement, military officers, politicians, and judges across multiple administrations at multiple levels of government. He had survived not only through brutality, but through intelligence, knowing precisely who to pay, who to threaten, and what information to retain as leverage. Under this theory, that leverage was the reason a trial was never going to happen. A public trial would have created a public record. A public record would have named names, and those names read aloud in a federal courtroom were ones no faction of the Mexican political establishment could survive. This framework circulated alongside one particularly inflammatory and unsubstantiated post claiming El Mencho maintained documentation of wrongdoing by prominent global figures, a claim fact-checkers found no verified basis for speculative disinformation. But the broader theory around political inconvenience as a motive for elimination rather than capture that remained impossible to fully dismiss, even without verification. The third strand was the most technically sophisticated and the most revealing about what the CJNG had evolved into by 2026. Within hours of the raid's announcement, AI-generated images began spreading across Mexican social media, burning airports, engulfed churches, street scenes of urban collapse, some depicting events in cities where nothing was actually occurring. The images were engineered to manufacture the perception of nationwide disintegration, to make the violence feel more absolute and more inescapable than the reality justified. Some of these images were almost certainly the product of cartel-linked operatives. By 2026, the CJNG had developed documented, sophisticated expertise in weaponizing social media algorithms, using coordinated posting campaigns, AI-generated visuals, and platform-native engagement mechanics to amplify fear across populations far beyond the cartel's actual physical reach. The chaos following El Mencho's elimination was not purely physical. A measurable portion of it was manufactured, and the manufactured version, because it was visual, shareable, and emotionally immediate, traveled faster than any verified account could follow. Analysts tracking the disinformation noted one pattern that was impossible to ignore. The most viral posts asserting El Mencho was alive circulated primarily in English. They were aimed not at Mexican audiences with direct access to Spanish-language official statements and domestic news coverage, but at global audiences in the United States, Europe, Latin America, for whom uncertainty was easy to generate and impossible to personally resolve. The disinformation campaign was calibrated. It targeted exactly the viewers who had no framework for evaluating FGR forensic protocols, no familiarity with Mexico's chain of custody procedures, and no way to independently confirm or deny anything they were reading. It was not aimed at the people closest to the truth. It was aimed at everyone else. Here is what is documented across every verified source, with zero ambiguity. The FGR conducted a complete forensic examination. El Mencho's identity was confirmed through DNA analysis. A death certificate was issued. On February 28, 2026, 6 days after the raid in Tapalpa, the Federal Attorney General's office officially transferred El Mencho's remains to unidentified family members, with genetic matches established and the full chain of custody legally documented. The family, described in reports as likely including close relatives from Michoacán or Jalisco, transported the body to Guadalajara, where final arrangements began on March 2nd. Those arrangements produced the golden casket, the rooster wreath, the banda music, the black umbrellas in clear weather, the 5 trucks of flowers, and the 80 armed personnel standing watch over a burial that half the world watched from a safe distance on their phones. The absence of a government photograph of the body is not evidence that El Mencho is alive. It is evidence of a policy decision, one that was legally defensible, procedurally consistent, and catastrophically ill-suited to the specific information environment surrounding this specific death. The CJNG had spent years building a disinformation infrastructure precisely for a moment like this, and when that moment came, the government handed that infrastructure exactly what it needed, not through malice, not through conspiracy, but through a policy that followed the law and ignored the consequences. So here is where we are left. Nemesio Rubeno Ceguera Cervantes built an empire estimated between $20 and $30 billion a year, with operations confirmed across more than 40 countries, fueling overdose epidemics, corrupting entire branches of government, and redrawing the geopolitical relationship between Mexico and the United States. He survived a decade as the single most hunted person in his country, outlasting kidney failure, billion-dollar manhunts, and the total collapse of every criminal organization he had previously been part of. He lost his life to multiple gunshot wounds sustained during a raid on a mountain estate in Jalisco, and he died mid-flight, en route to a hospital he never reached, bleeding out somewhere in the air above the country he had spent his life claiming. 8 days later, his body was in the ground in Zapopan, in a golden casket with a rooster wreath above it, and banda music below it, and mourners holding black umbrellas under a sky that gave them nothing to hide behind. And the cartel he built, franchised, decentralized, and architecturally designed from its founding to outlive him, kept operating. The question that nobody in power has answered, and nobody watching from a distance can stop asking, is this: if El Mencho designed the CJNG to survive his death, and the CJNG is surviving his death, then what exactly did the raid in Tapalpa actually change? Maybe everything, maybe nothing. And until that question has a real answer, the golden casket in Zapalpa is not the end of this story. It's just the most expensive chapter break.